So without further ado, I say welcome. We've got Tang coming in from Beijing. We've got Stacey. Hiya, Stacey from Canada. We've got Philip coming in from, I'm in Belgium. So Philip, you're just down the road. We've got Solly coming in from South Africa. And we've got Jolene coming in from Torino, Christine from Torino too, and Asa from Istanbul. Hi to everybody. And Hazel, our host with the most for today, is going to be talking to us from Wales. She will say Shemai, Shidichi. I hope you're all well. So over to you, Hazel. But thanks for joining. And Hazel, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'll just take a moment to share my screen with you. Okay. So hello and welcome to our assessment webinar. We're very pleased to have you all here today. And I never stop being absolutely thrilled at the thought of having a room full of people from all over the world so easily. So it's fantastic to have the opportunity to get so many different perspectives. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Okay, so the agenda for the webinar this afternoon focuses on all things entrepreneurial assessment. And we will be considering what makes assessment entrepreneurial, looking at the different forms and purposes of assessment in entrepreneurial education and beyond, looking at different types of assessment generally, and what this means for assessment mode and design. I'll touch on assessment in EntreComp, but the central feature will be a demonstration and rationale for the EntreAssess tool and the background to its development, drawing from the EntreAssess and EntreComp Edu projects. So I first started thinking about this question: what makes assessment entrepreneurial? A couple of years ago, when I became facilitator for the EntreComp Edu program. What's specific, special, or different about assessment for entrepreneurial education? So I'm very interested in your initial thoughts, because high levels of interest, there are high levels of interest in assessment in enterprise and entrepreneurship education. And this shows an appetite for assessment approaches which are different to more traditional academic methods. However, a shared definition of what could be called entrepreneurial assessment as appropriate to entrepreneurial learning is still emerging, still evolving, and still forming, if you like, as entrepreneurial learning approaches are adopted by more and more diverse purposes with different students in different places in wider ranging contexts. So I thought, as a bit of a warm-up and to give you the opportunity to meet new people and chat to people from across the world, I thought if we could spend 10 minutes in breakout groups having a chat around what you think, as an initial impression, makes assessment entrepreneurial off the top of your head, get you warmed up and thinking about it. So Ellen, if we could please put our participants into breakout groups. And the question is, what makes assessment entrepreneurial? And then when we come back, then we'll take a couple of minutes to gather your ideas and what you were talking about in your groups.
Welcome back, everybody. Back over to you, Hazel.
Lovely, thank you. So I'll feedback what we came up with in our group, and then if somebody from each group would be happy to share. So the points made for assessment to be entrepreneurial, our group felt that students should have the opportunity to make mistakes and to fail and to try again, to fail and put it right, you know, rather than just get it wrong and fail and have no marks. And that was just one chance. So also to have the opportunity to be creative, to present their learning creatively and make decisions about how best to evidence their learning. It shouldn't feel like assessment, it should feel like learning. We were all very clear that assessment should add value to learning. It should be purposeful, not just for its own sake. It should take learners forward in their learning journeys. And we also thought that it shouldn't be stressful, so that it can to promote learning and make students want to learn more and be more curious. That's what we came up with. So what about another group? You haven't nominated spokespeople as such. Would anybody like to volunteer to report to us what was discussed in their group?
Yeah, I will do so. We revolved a little bit around the question, how entrepreneurial should assessment be? And we think that it should be as entrepreneurial as the teaching itself. So not a fixed, prior defined thing or something. At the end, we discussed about, well, you should measure or assess something, which probably is about entrepreneurial behavior, and is there progress? Like when learners start from absolute beginners or novices to experts in some kind of entrepreneurial competence. So we made the comparison that as entrepreneurial assessments, or how entrepreneurial should assessment be, is about measuring performance. It's like you measure a business, so it's like you measure your own, like being a business. It's about self-knowledge. It should be reflective. You should show it. You could use techniques like the elevator pitch, where you reflect not only on the business, but like on the business of yourself. And I think that's about the most important things that we said. Is that correct? Group number 4. You can add if you want to.
That's great. Lovely.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Because it's a big question and 10 minutes wasn't long. So that's great. Thank you. How about somebody from another group would like to feedback?
Hazel, I may try, and maybe Nako can contribute me.
Great. Thank you, Saval.
Yeah, we have discussed that the entrepreneurial assessment should be based on the EntreComp flower. And it should assess the level of development, so self-assessment and the starting point and current, let's say, current capabilities are important for assessing the learner, let's say. And maybe Nako can add here, because he explained his experience in the university, and he said that when he accepts that all the learners at the beginning has the same level of competency, and they measure the level of development from which competency level to learners come and go to another one.
We call that either distance traveled.
Yeah, distance traveled,
exactly.
Added.
Yeah, or value added, yes.
So in fact, I have a question. I raised a question about the competency deficit. So do we use also, or should we use the competency deficit for the, at the beginning, for the entrepreneurial assessment?
That's a really interesting question, because we tend to do that a lot as teachers. We want to find out what our students need. So we tend to focus on what they cannot do, what the gaps are. And there's a whole sort of school of thought around that it's not the best place to start, that we should start with what they're good at and build confidence by working with strengths, to use those strengths to improve the gaps or the weaknesses, you know. But it's a perfectly understandable impulse or instinct to say, right, what are the needs? Where are the gaps? Let's fill those gaps, you know. But I think for balance, you know, for example, when we talk about giving feedback, theorists recommend that we should say 2 positive things and 1 developmental point. In primary schools in the UK, they call this 2 stars and a wish. So for a piece of work, when you feedback, you have to say 2 things you really like about it and 1 developmental point. So the ratio is 2 positives to 1 weakness, then if you like. So if we focus all our attention on what the students cannot do, that's not a very motivational or confidence building starting point. Perfectly understandable. It's information we need, but we need to balance it with building on strengths at the same time, because that's more motivational and can build confidence and self-esteem, perhaps. But yes, good point. Any other points then? Is it Nacho or Nacho?
It's Nacho.
That is a perfect question.
Nacho.
Yeah,
It's
sorry
Nacho,
for
it's
my
Nacho.
pronunciation.
Nacho.
Nacho or Nacho?
Yeah, you haven't seen me for some months, so that's why it's Nacho.
Nacho.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, just to add what Hazel has said, I think in our group, we all agree that it is a real big challenge. This entrepreneurial assessment, we all agree about that. We know it. We have talked about the need to be flexible in the assessment and not to have a fixed, something fixed or something rigid. It must be flexible. Also, from a formal and informal way, maybe make a mixture, something that Jean has said, and talking about who do the assessment. And that's another big question. We have talked about self-assessment, peer assessment, but also an expert assessment. I mean, the combination of everything, I think it's maybe the solution, or at least a way to start.
Yes, and that aligns with sort of validation work, doesn't it? You know how we like to triangulate evidence, to get different perspectives, to test evidence from using different perspectives, and having different actors involved in the assessment can give you those different perspectives, because self-assessment on its own may be not enough. Self and peer, maybe not enough. Self, peer and educated, great. Self, peer, educator and external person, professional person in the actual professional context, brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Great, thank you for that. And from another group, any feedback from another group?
If you don't mind, Hazel, I will.
Hi, Oliver. Yes, please.
Okay, yes, we had, especially with Ellen, a very interesting discussion. And there were 3 topics in our discussion. First, an assessment should take into consideration the learning journey of the individual participants. And regarding these learning journey, we have, of course, to look for the individual character of the learners. And there I was bringing in again the question if learning styles should be considered here, something I think you will like. And these 2 topics are all, let's say, feedback oriented, looking back to the previous learning journey or to the knowledge, competences acquired. But there is an aspect of feed forward to be considered for assessment as well. And when we consider that the core of entrepreneurial learning is creating values for others, then it is an issue which is related to the individual personality or to the character forming during an entrepreneurial learning training program, project, or course. These were our 3 topics discussed.
Great, lovely. Yes, good. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Oliver. Is there another group? Did we have 4 or 5 groups? Is there have all the groups had an opportunity to feedback? I think so. Okay, good. Right, I'll carry on. with my, thank you very much for that. That's great. So it's warmed you up and got you thinking about entrepreneurial learning and assessment and what we mean by these things. So thank you for your ideas. That's great. So then what makes assessment entrepreneurial then? So I'm very interested in using assessment to further the objectives of learning. And this is called constructive alignment. So that's when the aims of the learning align with the aims of the assessment, what it is we're actually looking to test. For example, in many cases, wouldn't it be, or often, for high stakes formal assessments don't offer the right methods to capture what it is they say they want to find out. An example might be writing an essay about being able to ride a bicycle. It's ludicrous. You know, writing an essay is not good. You could write the best essay in the world, but you're still not riding the bicycle. The best way to assess riding a bicycle is for somebody to actually ride the bicycle, you know, and whether they video record that or take photographs or there's a witness testimony. But constructive alignment means that we want what it is we want from the learning is what it is we need from the assessment. We need to be looking for the same things. So where educators focus on making sure that the assessment is actually assessing the desired forms of learning. In our group, for example, one of the points was that the assessment should be purposeful and should add value to the learning. And so the assessment should reflect those desirable types. Now, the EntreComp playbook sets out 9 principles of good or effective practice in learning, and to align constructively with this learning, assessment design should seek to draw from these principles. So these principles then, it's a really neat acronym, I think, that we've got EntreComp, and that EntreComp becomes the initial first letter of the word. So it helps us to remember these principles then. So these principles can be used as guiding quality or success criteria to support constructive alignment of the assessment design with what are agreed to be characteristics of effective entrepreneurial learning. So the playbook says that entrepreneurial learning should include these characteristics, 1 or more. So in the same way, our assessment design should seek to capture these same characteristics. So, for example, experience is about planning the entrepreneurial learning experience. Novelty focuses on new value creation. Triggers is about engaging learners with triggers for emotional learning so that it's meaningful for them and purposeful. Reflection then uses reflection to make the learning visible so that we can evidence the impact of our efforts. Ecosystem is about connecting with the wider ecosystem, drawing from the knowledge and expertise of people outside of our educational organization, because very often in real world situations, there are experts who do not work within our organizations. So how can we best involve the ecosystem and people, key players in the ecosystem in our assessment? Collaboration then, our assessment should include and promote collaboration between learners. Also engaging others. As Oliver said, if we are looking to create value for others, the best way to assess the value created is to check with the others we were creating that value for. Then we have mentoring, so that learners have access to effective mentoring, but also can become mentors themselves and can mentor other learning as a way of promoting their own and enhancing their own competence. But also finally then progression, so that we're using multiple methods. I think the point was made, you know, it's not possible always to get a rich enough picture of what it is we're looking for from one assessment method, you know, from just a piece of writing or just one photograph. So we want to mix methods and have multiple methods and multimodal evidence to be able to sufficiently represent the learning available in EntreComp. So then there are different types of entrepreneurial education and entrepreneurial learning, and these different types impact on the assessment design also. So for the three that we're looking at here is learning about, learning for, and learning through. So about courses help so if students are learning about entrepreneurship and enterprise, students learn about existing theories, knowledge and resources that enhance their understanding of a topic or theme. And they tend to draw from more traditional pedagogy involving lectures, set texts, to explore the theories that underpin enterprise and entrepreneurship. And so students may learn how enterprise and entrepreneurship has evolved as a discipline and will be required to look at literature, relevant literature, really. What are people saying about enterprise and entrepreneurship? So learning for enterprise and entrepreneurship, those courses focus on creating an enterprising approach. So aiming to help learners discover what it is to be enterprising, as well as offering insight into what it is to be an entrepreneur. It's a preparation, it's a preparatory method. And these courses are normally delivered through experiential learning opportunities that engage and enhance the student within meaningful and relevant contexts. And they challenge the student to think about the future and visualize opportunities. Students will typically be engaged in scenarios that challenge their thinking and require creativity and innovation. And as with all academic disciplines, practice should be underpinned by theory. So an ideal combination is to include learning both about entrepreneurship and enterprise, but also for within the curriculum. So then finally, the learning through activities focus on developing the entrepreneurial competence of the student and normally involve learning through doing, reflecting on experiences, thinking about theories in practice. So venture creation programs are an example of this. Also activities like incubators, incubation, accelerator schemes. These are sort of gateways between enterprise and entrepreneurship education and actually becoming an entrepreneur or entrepreneurial. So in designing and delivering assessment, then educators should consider the following. So if a student is learning about entrepreneurship, that's normally evaluated through analytical texts, you know, writing an essay or knowledge retention exercises such as exams. Whereas learning for entrepreneurship requires practical activities where students can demonstrate their development and their progress. But learning through entrepreneurship then is primarily a reflective process where a student will engage at quite a high level in entrepreneurial activities, but will map their own learning and be able to evidence their progression through those experiences then. So it's worth taking time to consider whether the learning you're delivering is it learning about entrepreneurship, is it for entrepreneurship, or is it through? Because that has implications also for the assessment design. So here are some more different types of assessment now then, which you'll be familiar with, hopefully. So we have assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. So assessment of learning tends to be summative. And as was mentioned in the earlier discussions in breakout groups, it tends to be after the learning has taken place. So we set out to learn something or to teach something, and was it learned? Did it work? What do they know? What can they do? What do they now understand as a result of that learning? And it's a summative snapshot in time. Assessment for learning is much more formative and diagnostic. And assessment for learning aims to inform the next steps of learning to promote further learning. What do I need to do next to get better at this? What are my next steps? What do I need to do to improve? Whereas assessment as learning is learning gained through involvement in the assessment process, the whole process, from deciding the purpose of the assessment, the assessment criteria, the design, the actual assessment judgments, the moderation of evidence, you know, all those processes associated with assessment that we all do as educators. Let's invite students and learners to take those roles, because there is so much learning for them available in that assessment as learning. And in many cases, when we focus on inviting students and learners to become assessors, the content they pick up incidentally. For example, when I was marking English exam papers, I remember all the information in the comprehensions, not because I was interested in polar bears or bananas, which were the topics of the comprehension, but just because I'd been looking for so many different features of these texts that I can tell you how much polar bears weigh, how fast they can run, how long you can train on the back of one banana. All this knowledge is with me still 15 years later. And I didn't even set out to learn it. I just picked it up incidentally through my involvement as the assessor. And in the same way, our students can gain very rich content, knowledge, learning from taking the role of assessor. So then, contemporary challenges in assessment. Recently, very recently, we've had, in lockdown, it wasn't possible for formal examinations to take place, and because everybody was at home. So these recent experiences in the pandemic have created the opportunity to revisit traditional and dominant assessment methodologies, and to revisit them in light of new ways of learning and new ways of working, in light of digital transformation and what we know about effective learning and cognitive development. So in a recent paper, Rethinking Assessment in Education, Bill Lucas, a very popular British educationalist, he identifies 4 categories within which to organise these shortcomings of the current assessment approaches. And I'm going to talk you through those now. So basically, what is assessed, how it's assessed, the impact of assessment, and the uses made of assessment. So I've set out some ideas in broad areas to organise interesting trends or new directions in assessment, which can be seen as opportunities to improve assessment practice through the creation of clear and shared principles for effective assessment. So in terms of what's assessed, then this is changing. The nature of learning is changing. So whereas traditionally subjects were assessed in separate and discrete assessments, now the nature of learning is much deeper and wider and more collaborative. So assessment should aim to capture what are agreed to be desirable kinds of learning. If we think learning is more successful when learners learn together, then we want to be able to capture that learning together in our assessments. Also, what is assessed, there's a lot of complaints from employers that when students leave education, they don't know the right things, they haven't got the right skills. You know, there's always a dissatisfaction with the content of what it is our students have learned. So we're really, at this point now in the 21st century, looking for a range of strengths, referred to as head, heart, and hand. So we're looking to capture competencies required for learning, life, and employment, a much broader reach than has been available before. So in terms of assessment methods and how the assessment takes place then, We want assessment to be ongoing and authentic. We want assessment to be a natural part of learning, adding value to the learning, rather than something that just happens once at the end of the period of learning. So we want assessment to add value to the learning. It should be pedagogically sensitive and educationally valuable, supporting and enriching learning goals. So in terms of our approach, we should be carefully evidencing capability, establishing clear and shared definitions of learning dispositions and progression to more reliably evidence higher order thinking skills, problem solving, real world applications and extended investigations using multimodal evidence, not writing always. But also in terms of credentials, as we mentioned in the discussion, there shouldn't just be one examiner. We want many more different perspectives. And the goal is to have a broad consortium. You know, if we go back to the ecosystem principle from the EntreComp playbook, we want to draw from the whole ecosystem to add value to assessment. And assessment, we want to support the creation of new assessment partnerships to develop performance and scenario-based assessments, which incorporate diverse data from a number of sources. So the impact of assessment, we talked in our group about how stressed our young people are and how stressful they find high stakes examinations. Whereas what we want the focus of assessment to be is predominantly formative. So assessment should support learning progress, supporting the development of mastery over time, reducing the tension between formative and summative approaches, and increasing learner confidence and motivation. So it isn't pass or fail, it's get better and better and better. So we want assessment to be personalized so that it can capture and report and reflect individual progression, providing engaging, equitable access to measures of progress which fairly evidence student progress and promote success. If students are only ever asked to write essays, for example, in assessments, for those students who like to express themselves in other ways, visually, through presentation, through interpretive dance, they will be disadvantaged by only ever being asked to write. There should be opportunities for students to present their learning in other ways. So in terms of the uses made of assessment then, and the style of credentials, we want evidence-based narratives. So assessment should support learners to express and articulate their learning, referencing wide-ranging, multimodal evidence to support and report it. In our group, we mentioned that students in traditional academic assessment are very passive. We want students to be active, creative contributors to the assessment process, and it should clearly reflect and represent the purpose it is intended to serve, with opportunities to involve students and teachers in all aspects of the assessment process and system. So this can increase transparency and reduce anxiety and develop further teacher and student capacities. Because at the moment, for example, in high stakes formal one-hit exams, you'll do the exam, it goes off to an examiner, a couple of months later, you get a result through the post, and it's not always clear why you did or did not pass or succeed in that achievement. Whereas if we can encourage our students to participate in the assessment, they then understand the assessment. And certainly for me, in my experience as a teacher, I learned so much about the learning from taking the assessment perspective, and then learned so much about assessment from taking the quality assurance perspective. So those gains are available to our students as well, if we involve them, if they become active participants in the whole process. So then in terms of what we're doing the assessment for, then we want to assess mostly for improvement and progress. So assessment should be a tool for improvement to enhance student performance over time. So I'd like to pause there and ask if there are any comments or questions on any of those challenges around contemporary assessment and the ideas drawn together in those slides. Any questions or comments?
Yes, Hazel, I've got a question. You talk about assessment of, assessment for, and assessment as. I have pretty clear the first two, of and for, but I haven't understood quite well the assessment as.
So it's when we talk about students being engaged in all aspects of the assessment process. So assessment as learning, a student could learn a lot of content and knowledge by writing a test for somebody else. So then, so they use the knowledge and the content and the competences to create the assessments, to deliver the assessment, and to actually be the examiner, you know, be the assessor as learners. So when assessment as learning is very much focused on inviting learners to be assessors, to be examiners, to design tests, to design exams, to provide feedback. And it's the assessment as learning is the learning available from inviting students to be assessors.
Okay,
Does that help?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's pretty clear. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments before I move on? Okay, right. So I'll go back to share my screen. So then the EntreAssess tool that I want to introduce to you today was developed as part of the EntreComp Edu course. And I was absolutely thrilled to be invited to facilitate on the EntreComp Edu course. As a teacher of competences, I'd encountered a long-standing issue where entrepreneurial learning is perceived as an add-on, something separate and different. And educators need a clear understanding of how these pedagogies and principles can actually support curriculum and subject delivery, whilst potentially addressing wider learning priorities, such as learner engagement, well-being, citizenship, social cohesion, or employability. And I really love the vision statement for the EntreComp Edu course, although I would add to it to be part of a workforce and community, because I believe that the value of these competences extend beyond the workplace, into the community, into family groups, across all domains of life. So the vision for the EntreComp Edu course then is a world in which every learner has the entrepreneurial skills to be part of a workforce, community, family group that is alert and responsive to change and capable of designing and implementing new solutions to complex problems. So within the course then, there was the EntreComp Edu framework, which was a reference point setting out the competencies that teachers need to be able to develop entrepreneurial learning practices in their teaching. There was a self-assessment tool to establish a baseline or starting point, you know, to encourage educators to reflect on where entrepreneurial learning might be already in their practice. Then there's the online course, of course, and a map of practical examples. So obviously, I'm sorry, one sec. No, I'll come to it in a minute, sorry. Okay, so the framework, the EntreComp Edu framework, set out 6 broad principles of effective practice, which characterize entrepreneurial education. And because the last 10 years of my working life have been centered around assessment, I was particularly interested in module 4 of the course, which is about assessment. So I thought that this would be an excellent opportunity when we were looking at the development of module 4 to draw from the work of EntreComp Edu, but also another EU project, EntreAssess, and to bring together learning and outputs of the different projects to really boost the value of both. And you'll recognize some of these principles from the EntreComp playbook there are some overlaps and some similarities, but they've been applied here for educators. So that's the EntreComp Edu course. And then the EntreAssess project set out the beginnings of a developmental progression framework for assessment literacy for entrepreneurial education. So it provides an overview of innovative and adaptable tools, a really nice collection of tools that will add value to entrepreneurial learning, aimed at enhancing innovation and resourcefulness of all students. So then this is the progression framework. So the way the EntreAssess project sets out entrepreneurial assessment is across 6 questions. What are we assessing, when, where, how, who, and why, but across 3 developmental levels. So there's initiating, developing, and performing. So that was a really good starting point. And I used this progression model and added in detail for additional levels, because I felt that there was the need for additional steps in between initiating and developing to create a taxonomy of 6 levels or stages of maturity for the purposes of the EntreAssess tool. So then so I used the survey format to present a series of questions about if, when, where, who, and why educators are assessing entrepreneurial competences. And based on the survey responses, a personalized report is produced, identifying levels of maturity for each of the questions, providing differentiated competence descriptors across those levels. And people who complete the EntreAssess tool receive a personalized report, which includes tailored suggestions for activities to develop and progress assessment practice. So the report outlines the next steps in terms of learning activities, assessment methods, and strategies for online practice, called Take It Online. And that's supported by the benefits of using each of those approaches. So use of the tool draws from the 6 principles of effective entrepreneurial education, in that it stimulates reflection and learning from experience. It increases visibility, making entrepreneurial competences an explicit part of learning and assessment. And the activities suggested promote creative approaches to assessment and the use of multimodal evidence and collaborative approaches, where students are really active decision makers and managers of the assessment processes. And for me, this is a crucial dimension of entrepreneurial assessment as compared with other more traditional types of educational assessment, where students are passive and recipients. And it's a part of self-efficacy and self-awareness to be able to use evidence to claim competence. So what I was hoping to do by developing this tool was to engage students on the EntreComp Edu program and promote interaction, in that the survey completion is purposeful, it's practical, it's directly applicable, and future oriented. Picking up on Oliver's point, you know, that feed forward point, the report is very much about, here's where you are at the moment, and these are the steps you can take going forward to improve. So personalizing the assessment output, using the multiple choice questions and the framework to develop a differentiated snapshot of performance, accommodating a spiky profile across the areas, because some people may be better at the what than the how, or the who than the when. So people will have spiky profiles there. Essentially, the survey is artificial intelligence. It's AI, you know, it's personalizing learning, it's tailoring a report personalized to the person who completed the survey. And I wanted to demonstrate and test the use of simple tools like a survey, like multiple choice questions, to achieve more complicated outcomes. Artificial intelligence sounds a bit scary, but it doesn't have to be. Self-assessment to benchmark practice across those 5 markers stimulates reflection, but also recognition and helps learners articulate the complexity of the construct, but also what progression looks like within it. So demonstrating the use of assessment as learning demystifies assessment to increase the visibility of the entrepreneurial competences as an explicit part of learning and assessment. Increasing educator and thereby learner assessment literacy and proficiency in claiming and evidencing entrepreneurial competence in creative and multimodal ways. And I have to be honest and say that a fringe benefit of the use of the tool is that it actually builds a data set in the background. In the back of the survey, we have this data set, which creates a really interesting snapshot of assessment literacy amongst respondents over time. And it was fascinating to get a snapshot of where educators are in their practice, which competencies they are happiest to assess, and which competencies they haven't even tried to assess. So the data, using the tool with teams, with colleagues, can get you some really useful data to inform future training opportunities. So the structure of the report then, there are 6 report sections. So the first is your level of maturity. Where are you in this taxonomy? Where next? What are your next steps? What are you aiming for next? What's the next step? But then ideas for learning activities that you can use with your students, ideas for assessment activities, and ideas for online practice. And then there's that benefit element as well. So this is a sample extract for you to have a look at. So you can see here the question is, are you assessing entrepreneurial skills? So there's the response, and there's that your level is developing, and there's a description of what that level looks like, and also the next step, what you're aiming for, you're aiming to achieve. And these are ideas for learning and assessment activities and online activities, which will help you move from your existing level to the next level. And also then at the bottom, you can see why should you use this, and there's the benefit of using those different activities. So there are no scores in the report. Rather, the feedback is formative. And whilst the evidence will be used for summative purposes, the greater value of this assessment tool, I think, is that it seeks to measurably improve practice and competence. Okay, so in terms of why are we assessing then? So assessment for measurement requires a stable metric. So there are different purposes. You know, we were talking about the purposes as being learning, or assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. There are other purposes used in assessment as well. So for example, assessment for measurement, this requires a stable metric to identify a starting point that I think, as Saval was saying, the starting point and the distance traveled. So how far has somebody come? Assessment for selection, where we want a rank order, who's the best, going down from who's the best to who's the weakest, or criterion referenced assessment can be used for selection, you know, competence criteria. Assessment to diagnose next learning steps, assessment to evidence impact or competence, assessment to evaluate approaches taken. You know, often as teachers, we will assess, reflect on our practice to evaluate it and assess ourselves to find better ways to improve our practice. If something doesn't work, what do we need to do next time to make sure that the learning is effective? And another way, and then the other way of classifying assessment is the one that we've discussed: assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. And I've put some slightly different definitions there. So assessment of learning, what learning is taking place retrospectively. Assessment for learning, what further learning can we gain? What shall we do next? And assessment as learning, what do we learn about learning by assessing? Okay, So then in terms of how are we assessing and the methods, here are some questions which have been used to help educators reflect on their practice. But I think these questions, when we talk about constructive alignment and desirable forms of entrepreneurial learning, these questions could also be used to test our assessment method and design. So are we allowing learners to interact with people outside of class? Are we encouraging learners to take risks, to dare and to fail? Can they have more than one attempt at getting it right, which is what happens in real life? Do we allow learners to develop ownership of their progress and process? Do we encourage learners to work in teams? Do we require learners to create value for people outside of the group, really working for others? Do we assess learners by giving activity and reflection-based feedback? Do we require learners to work iteratively? Do we give them opportunities to continuously improve their outputs and learning? And do we connect to subject matter, knowledge and skills? So there are some useful questions there. In terms of when are we assessing then, so there tends to be cycles of assessment. And within learning organizations, the predominant assessment cycles include these 5 stages. Not all of them necessarily, but usually one or more from the whole selection there. So screening and skills checks, for example, tend to focus on a smaller number of high-level criteria to assess things like suitability for a program, for an opportunity or a job, or to identify specific support needs. Is this person in or out? Does this person need help? Can this person does this person have the right competence to be able to function effectively within this opportunity? So it's screening, in or out. Initial assessments identify reasonably accurate starting points for learning, usually mapped to shared standards, and the initial assessments can be used as a baseline from which to measure progress and development. So it's in more detail than the screening assessments. Diagnostic assessments provide a detailed snapshot or learner profile to identify appropriate next steps. So where am I now? You get that information from the initial assessment, and the diagnostic assessment identifies the next steps. Formative assessments identify how a learner is progressing against objectives and what further learning is required. And formative assessments are also used to evaluate the impact of chosen learning approaches. So I delivered this class like this. Did it work? What did they learn? How could I do it better? That sort of thing. And then the summative assessment is a snapshot of performance, usually undertaken at the end of a program for reporting or accreditation or certification purposes. So educator assessment practice tends to fall into one or more of the types described at the different points in the assessment cycle. So who is assessing then? There's a nice quote there from Dylan William, who is like the hero of all things assessment. He wrote the book on assessment for learning, out to the black box, outside the black box. Anyway, superb. He got us all talking about assessment for learning and changing our assessment practice to add value to learning rather than it being this activity that was left until the end. So there's a quote there from him that says, there is significant body of research that shows that 1 hour students spend devising questions about what they have been learning with correct solutions, where they are actually developing the test and the mark schemes for themselves, is more effective than 1 hour spent completing practice tests. So if we activate and empower our students to become assessors, the learning is much richer and more effective. So who is assessing? So in entrepreneurial assessment, then we think that learners should be supported to draw from wide-ranging evidence, data, and reflection to evaluate their own learning and others' learning performance. Teachers and educators, they're usually the people who are most involved in the assessment, But teacher assessment can be of learning to report outcomes and impact. It can be for learning to identify further learning gains, effective learning approaches, and further learning needs and goals. And teacher assessment can be designed and led by students as learning, inviting learners to become the experts in the subject matter. But interestingly, and I think this is something specific potentially to entrepreneurial assessment, is to involve external actors. We're very good in entrepreneurial education at using role models and external speakers and so on. And these people have huge value to add to our assessment processes. Employers and other external stakeholders are often the ones saying how dissatisfied they are with academic assessment methods and outputs. They're not leaving school with the competences we need. You're not teaching them what we want them to know. So this is a really good opportunity to get them in and make the assessment more relevant, more purposeful, more valuable to the real world. So also inviting active contribution from employers and others highlights the relevance and purpose of the assessment to learners. So this business of building clear links to the world of work can motivate students and learners, and also improve learners' work readiness, having the chance to include sector requirements into content and assessment, and recruit better trained staff. And these can all be motivators for employers or business people or entrepreneurs to become engaged with assessment processes. So examples of employer involvement in assessment can include things like inviting employers to comment on written work, practical coursework, assessment in the workplace. They can provide expert witness testimonies and feedback on performance tasks and evidence. So there's a lot of value from including other people. Okay, here we go, this is it. So there's an introduction to the tool, and it's literally, when you click on the link, it takes you straight into the survey. So you'll see here, are you assessing entrepreneurial competences? And you pick one then, which most closely reflects your practice. So which ones, say those, for example, when, where, who, why, and then it's complete. So it's actually now creating my personal report, which is very exciting. But I would urge and encourage you, strongly encourage you to actually have a turn, use the tool, complete the assessment. So this is the report. So then it gives me a report for each of the questions. So for each of those questions I answered, it gives me a level, current level of competence, next, learning activities, assessment activities, online activities, and the benefits. You see, so it's the same structure for each. Now, this is a beta version of this tool, and we're very keen to take it forward and to improve it, for example, by adding additional learning activities or additional assessment activities, or there might be additional benefits. So we would certainly invite you to complete it and come up with ideas for how we might make the tool, how we can make the tool more useful, really. Let's add value to the tool. So that's a very quick trot through the actual survey. And as I've already mentioned, we're very interested in how we can improve it, or inviting you to contribute to improving it. If you have the time and the interest to complete the assessment after our meeting today, and you've got ideas or activities that you think could improve it, please get in touch and help us with it. And that's the end of my presentation. Any questions or comments?
Yes, we had a question from Saval who needed to leave us, so I'll ask it on her behalf, which is about micro-credentials.
Yes.
So she would like to know what kind of link we have between the European approach to micro-credentials and credentials of entrepreneurial assessment.
Right, I don't know whether I can. Micro-credentials, the way I understand micro-credentials is that they're badges or recognition of some sort, could be a certificate, that represents small units of competence. So a micro-credential could be for like one competence, for example. Right, so now I've clarified in my own mind what I think micro-credentials are. Ask me that question again, please, Megan.
Yes, of course. What kind of link do we have between the European approach to micro-credentials and credentials of entrepreneurial assessment?
See, I don't know if I can answer that question.
It's okay, Hazel, if you're not an expert on micro-credentials, that's
well,
fine.
yeah, I don't think I know all that exist. You know, I'm not aware of them all. It's quite a new field. So I think I would probably have to research and then pull together all the ones that I could find and then make links. So without doing that, I wouldn't be able to answer that question. But I can assure you that after this meeting, that's something I'm going to do. So the next time I'm asked that question.
Can I add to that? Because I've been trying to work a little bit on understanding the sort of micro-credentialing approach. And what we can do, it's like you say, it's like recognition for a small or even a large chunk of learning that maybe it's kind of used more in vocational professional education, especially in the US, but it's coming over here big and strong. But I think we should be considered, because one thing I always think, right, entrepreneurial assessment, entrepreneurial competence development, these sorts of things, you know, people say, oh, you know, working inside a company, that's entrepreneurial, that's a practical entrepreneurial experience. Yes, it's an entrepreneurial environment, maybe, but it's not necessarily an entrepreneurial experience for the learner. So sometimes we need to make sure that these things are explicit, included, and valued, assessed in this process. So I'd say that it depends on the micro-credentials, and they can be entrepreneurially assessed, but they might not necessarily be so, even if sometimes they are, you know, very practical in orientation.
And just to add, the question, even it may not be intentional, but it suggests that the sort of the development of a micro-credential framework in Europe is far further along than maybe where we are on the entrepreneurial competency. So having, you know, sort of following this emerging framework in Europe, I would say that we're both kind of following parallel paths. At one point, I think there is a potential for what, you know, Bantani does to sort of fit into that larger framework, but the framework in Europe is emerging. And, you know, starting with, you know, what is a micro-credential? I think that the work is now just being published now in terms of, right, the Commission's approach.
Thank you, thanks. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, we have another question in the chat, Hazel, so I'll ask it for Abel, who's asking, the EntreComp framework states 15 competencies. So the teaching practices used to be oriented to the design of a business model. Are these competencies aligned with parts of the business model?
Yes, I would say yes, definitely. That is the short answer. But in terms of EntreComp, we actually did a scan of EntreComp. There's a significant proportion of EntreComp competencies which are actually assessment literacy, if you like. So if a learner was competent across the 15 competencies, about a quarter, about 25% of those competencies are to do with understanding strengths and weaknesses, working on areas that need development, using evidence to prove impact, lots and lots and lots. Oh, let me just get up my list. Here we go. Yes. So there are, if I can share my screen to show you, this is the analysis here. So yes, analysis of EntreComp identifies 128 learning outcomes which relate to assessment and evaluation. So, I mean, there's the thread in ethical and sustainable thinking, assessing impact, being accountable, risk management, risk assessment, identifying strengths and weaknesses. All of these, monitoring progress, being flexible, learning from experience, all of these competencies are rooted in assessment and evaluation literacy, I think. Does that answer that one? Okay, good, thank you. Any other questions or comments? You're just all inspired to silence, aren't you? But I mean, I make this point over and over again, and I've said this lots and lots of times. This is a work in progress. You know, our in assessment, we talk about having a construct. What is it that we're assessing? So in terms, we're in the process of really, or the construct for entrepreneurial assessment then is emerging and evolving. And as we're working with different groups and we're gaining these different perspectives and looking at different pieces of evidence for different purposes, it's sort of clarifying this construct. So it's something that's in development, that's improving and progressing. And we urge you to stay with us and work with us to help us to clarify and implement effective entrepreneurial assessment for our learners.
Thanks everybody for joining us, and have a lovely rest of week.